that you might have. Excellent. Now I'm on record, but after a day with 3 parallel sessions, 2 times, if you have one insight to share from the day, it'd be lovely to see it in the chat, and then we can cross-fertilize a bit all of these ideas. But yeah, fantastic to see you, so many of you back. And this is not an improvised talk because it used to be in the schedule, and I prepared for it. I definitely put together some slides, as you can see, but it was supposed to be part of a session. And then Wendy did a lot of magic, and Constance did, a lot of magic as well to iron out what happens when some people sadly could not attend. So we kind of had to reshape a little bit the event for today. So I think we're supposed to have 4 papers in the last sessions, and we have 3. In any case, we ended up with having this as a bit of a plenary at the end of the day. And Constance and I are very happy to share with you a few ideas about one other type of future that we are hoping to work on together. And hopefully this will be of interest for at least some of you. So it is hope. Hope is a word that came back again and again in the different sessions I chaired. So I'm happy to bring it one more time. Hope is an acronym here. It stands for Horizons of Possibility, and also the word estimation. If anyone has a better E term there, evaluation, estimation. Actually, I'm inspired here by a work done by Giovanni Corazza, who often uses estimation in some of his work on creativity. So what I'm going to talk about to you is analyzing data. And I'm not taking analysis as a very narrow, this kind of process that tries to always have a recipe for the steps of the analysis and the conclusions we end up with. I think it would be a shame for possibility studies to have these kind of formulas, but we still have to think about the data we work with, whether it is conversations or drawings or music, whether we recognize it as data and collect it deliberately, or we just process it as it comes. We all work with information. We all work with, with artifacts and movement and things that come our way. So as a community, and building up on the Cambridge event that very nicely had the theme of research in possibility studies, Constance and I, and actually we put our names here, but this is a much wider conversation. And we had it with Nicolas Verger, who is a postdoc on the DCU Center for Possibility Studies. With Wendy, we talk a lot, and we keep bringing this notion up. So I'm happy, probably in premiere, to share with you one way in which Constance and I and others thought about working with data in possibility studies. And just to say, this is a piece of a puzzle that is much wider. This will sound very self-interested that I've referenced here a lot of the work I've been doing with colleagues, but there is so much more here. But just to make you aware, and I think many of you who have been following PSN know about this, there are multiple theories and approaches we use when we talk about possibility. My preferred one, yeah, I'm on record, but I can definitely say preferred, is the sociocultural approach. And it started from my work in creativity, and it moved into the realm of the possible. But we also have very cognitive accounts. We have people who work with art and education. So there are a variety of theories and kind of theoretical concepts and figures that we look up to. Then we're also, as a community, very much focused on interventions. And this is a word I use also for practice and for just creating a change in the world. We, as I think collectively as pragmatists in this, kind of big community, I think we all believe that a good theory is a theory that does something good in the world. So there are many initiatives and many toolkits. Actually, we had a whole stream of session on toolkits in the in-person conference. But for example, to give one, again, personal approach to that would be a recent paper and work done on possibility spaces as a concept that talks about interventions and how we think about creating trainings and workshops and longer sessions and programs that work with people collaboratively in a participatory way to enhance possibility thinking, imagination, agency, and so on. Another area of work is one of evaluation, assessment, and even psychometrics. Now, I am not a psychometrician, I will tell you that. And those who know my work probably are even surprised that I kind of delve into this area as well. But together with other colleagues, with Wendy and Ron, and especially Maciej Karwowski, who is a psychometrician, I would call him, we developed this self-report 12 items questionnaire scale, possibility thinking scale. And this is something that has been picked up by colleagues and it's being used. And, you know, instead of looking at it, and it is certainly not a measurement of possibility or even possibility thinking, it is more of a self-report reflexivity opportunity for people to think about how they relate to the possible in their lives. So we're trying to work on this area of evaluation as well. But collectively also, and this is the point I want to get you to actually, is the point of method and methodology. How do we work with data? What kind of data do we have? And methods famously relate to methods of data collection, but also methods of data analysis. And we collect data in different ways. We can go to the archive, we can interview, we can have focus groups, as we know, we can run experiments, and many of our colleagues do that. But what I'm going to focus on now is how we analyze the data we have. And when we think about data, actually, as a community, I think, and as a larger community within the social sciences, psychology, the humanities, art and design, education, I think there are many steps forward to try to transcend the old dichotomy between quantitative and qualitative. I think those epistemological debates are still very important. And of course, we should engage with them because there are elements of difference that should be discussed. But we should also acknowledge the fact that, you know, the last point there, we live in a world of big qualitative data. For example, with AI, with what's happening online on the internet, social media, and the rest, we are immersed in a world of data. That data is very qualitative in nature. It often has to do with stories and text and narrative, but also with sensations, you know, the way we move, the experiences we have. They're very qualitative. But quantification, obviously, and you know, we can have a wider discussion after. Quantification is not the enemy, and I think pragmatically we need to work to understand what and how we can quantify certain aspects of what we do, what is the meaning of that, and how that relates to perhaps more qualitative approaches. And I think all of us are, again, or many of us are animated by mixed methods, which is such a growing field. It's been growing for a long time now, but also participatory research, because in many ways, what is the aim of research? You know, Habermas talked about describing the world, controlling the world, or empowering. And I think in the possibility studies community, we all have, or most of us have, this very much the ethos of empowering with our research. So participatory research is obviously very, very important. So the estimation part, the horizon of possibility estimation, starts with this notion of horizons of possibility. And this is something that Constance actually, and in dialogue with her and with many other people, we're trying to kind of grasp what many presenters have said today, that there is an element of possibility that we can enact in the world, but the way we think about that possibility, the way we perceive it or do not perceive it, lack this awareness that something is possible, is crucially important. I'm inspired a lot here, by the way, by Vygotsky's idea of zone of proximal development, right? That is very much a sociocultural, a social and material space of engagement with human development, with what can be, not only what is or what the child or any person could do, can do, apologies, but what they could do, right? That is a horizon of possibility. And I'm also very much inspired by theories of action and activity. And although I like cognition and thinking, I find them to be very much embedded in action and what we do and in being more generally. But if we take this idea of action, every act has associated with it specific horizons of possibility, including possibilities for further action, right? The moment we act, we open up new pathways in front of us. But what's interesting about human action is that it also simultaneously closes down possibilities, because someone, I think it was Jan Valsiner, one of my mentors, who at some point said the moment of action is monological. There is no dialogue because you collapse a lot of possibilities into one thing that you get to do. But at the same time, by doing that, you kind of restart opening up new possibilities, moving from there, right? So there is something very interesting about horizons of possibility associated with how we think, how we speak, how we act, what we put forward, and what kind of, futures we construct with that, and what kind of futures we close down because of that. And another part that is very interesting, I think, to all of us is that this happens almost automatically, through the act of being and living. We are, dwelling in a space of possibilities. We get to choose and think about some of them. And sometimes decisions are made without us even thinking about them, or decisions are made for us. And it's interesting when we become aware, and there was a question about awareness in one of the sessions I got to chair today. What is awareness of possibility, right? And are we always aware of all the possibilities or more of the possibilities we have? A lot of us are working on this idea of expanding our understanding of what might be possible, expanding that awareness. And what constrains us, and this is really not an exhaustive list of factors, power relations. Obviously, some things become invisible to us because of how we are positioned in society. And I think very nicely, the first keynote and through these 2 days, we think a lot about power, inequality, care, empowerment, and things like that. There is an element, I'm coming from psychology. I'm not a cognitive psychologist, but I'm a bit familiar. Many of you would be with all sorts of cognitive biases that anchor our thinking. Dunker had this, from the 50s or 40s, 50s, functional fixedness, right? This idea that we sometimes don't perceive the diversity and multiplicity of the world because we are anchored by what is conventional, what is hegemonic and dominant and kind of given knowledge to us, right? A cup, I have this cup over here. Usually we think of it as pouring liquid in it, but a cup can be so many other things. And because it has some liquid, I'm not going to put it as a hat right now. But anyway, so we have a lot of cognitive biases as well. And then we have what, again, psychologists talk about: resources, time, and motivation. It's almost like a luxury, sometimes a privilege, to have the time to think about possibilities. And sadly, for many of us and for all of us at some point, life happens way too fast, and we engage in what psychologists call system one thinking, which is very automatic, right? So this space of deliberation, what is possible, what might be possible, is both very common, it's very human. I'm using inverted commas. I don't want to be a speciesist here, but it's something we engage with a lot. But it is also something we need to curate and we need to kind of take care of and foster. So I think one of the big questions, again, as a community, that we often come back to are these questions of how does this happen? How do we engage with horizons of, how do we expand them? How do we contract them? What are the consequences, especially in terms of possibilities for future action, possibilities related to care, to human dignity, right? To our existence in the world. These are big foundational questions. But also, and related to that, how do we work analytically? If we want to do research on this, how can we do this research? And this is where Constance and I and others are thinking of making a contribution. So HOP, I love silly acronyms, or maybe not that silly, but yes, we're going to hop together, Horizons of Possibility. For those of you who have ever heard me talk about anything, probably it was only 2 or 3 minutes in when I started mentioning the word perspective. And I might be triggering some of you because you're going to think, oh, he's going to talk about that again. And I will a little bit, because this is really my own entry point into how we exist as beings of the possible, right? We exist in the world by, being positioned in it. We are positioned physically, we are positioned socially, we're positioned symbolically. At this very moment, I have a physical positioning and background, and I have a visual perspective of my screen, and you would have another visual perspective on it. But more importantly, I'm a position within a specific role. I'm the speaker now, and then later on, hopefully, I will shift that role into being the listener. And I will listen to you, or we'll get to chat about these ideas. And from all these positions, we develop perspectives, which are ways of acting in, thinking about and approaching and understanding the world and ourselves within it. So this idea that the cup is for drinking is a perspective on the cup and what the cup could be. The idea that democracy is threatened in the world today is another perspective. And these come from different positions, because there will be other people, it might shock you, who think democracy is doing just fine, or maybe we should have no democracy. And they come from other positionings, socially, historically, culturally, and so on. And then what's interesting is the dialogue. what's very, very interesting to me and many others is the dynamic between perspectives. What happens when these ideas, narratives, perspectives meet, clash, they merge, or they multiply, and some of them disappear, and some of them are denied or ignored, and so on and so forth, right? So a lot of my work, a lot of the work I know from other people focuses a lot on listening into conversations or looking at narratives online, offline, and actually expanding this conceptual framework to nonverbal data as well. For example, you can think of movements, right? We are often positioned, actually positioning is a language of the body and of movement. We are positioned and we reposition ourselves and we exchange positions, and therefore we develop new horizons for our action. And then if you look at dancers or improvisers or, people walking on the pavement, together, there is almost a dialogue or a rhythm or a synchronicity that happens between these movements. So I think it is interesting with this perspective position dialogue to look beyond textual data, a point I'm going to come back to a little bit later. So why hop? Why should we hop? There are many interesting, hopefully, reasons to think about with this apparatus. First of all, what we assume is possible often counts more than what is possible. I'm very kind of, I'm wary of not reifying possibilities and creating all sorts of kind of debates around realism and so on. But it is true that what we think is possible counts a lot for what we actually get to do. And as I said at the very beginning, a lot of it remains implicit or unexamined. So having a method of analysis that purposefully looks for deliberation and reflection in relation to this could be useful. Then the focus on dialogues wakes us to the idea that, again, we all know from our work that horizons of possibility, they're not only depending on physical possibilities. A lot of them do. There is a lot of physics I mean, there are theories of possibility, in mathematics and probability and so on. But a lot of what we talk about, actually, possibilities are anchored in our social life and our historical existence, the greater duration of all of these positionings that we have in the world, whether we are men, women, we have to the non-binary, many other categories, whether we are from Romania or Ireland, we carry with us a historicity of a range of perspectives. And here I should say I'm very much inspired by dialogism and Bakhtin and all of these wonderful thinkers who thought about how we speak and the things that speak through us and through our language. As I'm giving you this talk now, I have specific ways of positioning, right? And I'm presenting to you perspectives that make sense from a particular academic and lived experience. And finally, interestingly, horizons of possibility are not only about the future. I did mention that it's about future action, and we are beings oriented towards the future. I think that matters a lot. But possibility studies is not future studies. That already exists, and it's a fascinating field. I invite all of you to obviously connect to it as well. But you can have possibilities act out in the present, and possibilities can be applied to the past. Actually, Constance, and other colleagues are doing work on conspiracy theories, which, if you think about the dynamic of a conspiracy theory, it's really questioning the world as it is and kind of sometimes reimagining the past and thinking about, okay, well, if we think about it differently, what does it mean for what happened, right? So we can expand this notion to look at future, present, and past. Okay, so let's think about hope. Hope and what would be the analytical steps that myself and other colleagues are thinking about applying for a type of analysis that, if you're interested in, I would love to remain in dialogue and kind of work on different types of data and think about these analytical steps. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the three questions that we use a lot analytically are the following. First, what are the key, I'm calling them, to avoid the word perspective, points of view expressed, right? It is an exercise of identifying perspectives, narratives, stories within a piece of data. And I'm going to anchor this a lot in text, but at the end, I'm going to bring back the non-textual, okay, the non-verbal, non-textual. So what is being told here? What are these points of view? This is one of the first steps. And I think it's very akin to thematic analysis, for those of you who work with qualitative methods. And if we look at these as macro perspectives, as stories, because stories are themselves these macro perspectives that have a variety of different perspectives within them, we can rely for this step on things like narrative analysis that already exists, right? We're looking at actors and action and the succession of things. That can be an interesting approach to look at how perspectives are put forward. But the second step, very important for us here, is we have to think about what makes these perspectives meaningful, what renders them intelligible, what gives them meaning and sense. Even a conspiracy theory, some of the most wild conspiracy theories that are obviously untrue and quite problematic, they come from somewhere. They carry with them a certain view of the world that is in turn anchored within certain experiences, within specific groups and ways of positioning, right? So we have to, it is recommended, I would say, when we talk about these perspectives and the horizons of possibility, they open or close or change, to think about where do these perspectives come from? What is their logic, if you want? And although I haven't done very often, I'm familiar with discourse analysis. Some of you might be as well. This is one of the closest types of analysis that tries to understand this deeper level of meanings and significance that goes towards history and power relations and the deep social issues we talk about with perspective. So what are the points of view and what is their origin? What is their logic? What makes them meaningful? And the third step would be what happens to them, right? So if we go, and I'm going to give an example in a moment, we work with online data. Often you have these threads with comments and then, posts and a comment and a reply to comment. And we have that in everyday conversation as well. And in brainstorming, by the way, brainstorming could be analyzed also in terms of dialogue turns that come one after the other. So examining dialogues is a very important point as well. So one point of inspiration can be conversation analysis here, but you can think about these tracing ideas or tracing themes within your data and seeing what happens to these themes. Are they expanded? Are they denied? Are they ignored? What happens to them? So these would be the three key analytical steps. What are the key perspectives or points of view? What is their origin? What is their logic? And what happens to them in dialogue? And I wish that I would have a lot of well, I don't have the time now, but more concrete examples for you. But I'm going to give you a real and yet a bit of hypothetical example, as some of my students and I and my colleagues are working on a Reddit study around climate change. So we took climate change as a big repository of perspectives and narratives and dialogues about horizons of possibility, impossibility, and so on. And we're looking at two specific communities, the Reddit on climate change and the Reddit on climate skeptics. And if you've been on Reddit, you probably know these are ideologically kind of different from each other, and you would get much more climate denial type of conversations in climate skeptics. And this is, by the way, another important point. By naming this hope and by having all these positive vocabulary, we have to confront the fact that many possibilities and many acts of reflexivity can lead us to quite negative spaces. And not everybody is about empowering or, supporting others. And we need to analyze those dynamics as well and to understand their origin and their consequences. So this is not actual data, as we are just now collecting and working through that. But just to, kind of exemplify a little bit what I mean by that, when we look at these Reddit communities and the different posts and comments around them, we can start to identify these macro perspectives or narratives. For example, the appeal to scientific consensus around global warming. That is one big way in which, especially in the Reddit on climate change, people start conversing about what's happening in the world. But juxtaposed with them, and very interestingly, you have these more individually grounded perspectives that stem from the life experience of specific people. I'm tired of how many people say, well, it's very cold in this winter, so clearly nothing happens. But then, those are those perspectives. But then you have, local farmers who might experience unpredictable weather and come with those experiences to this dialogue. So the first step would be to understand what are the main stories and narratives, whether these are more macro kind of things that have a lot of implicits, because we talk about climate change research, but I don't understand fully all of it, let's say, but we kind of appeal to it and we rely on it. And then more individual perspectives. And these communities are a meeting point for a lot of these. The second step would be to understand the anchoring, to understand the background, the logic behind these. So the scientific perspective, of course, very often is anchored in empirical research and all sorts of modeling around global climate. And here is where you get, interestingly, right, discussions sometimes around what kind of research it is and questions around it and so on. But sometimes these are left completely in the background. The appeal to the value of science, for instance, and what makes it powerful and sometimes, sadly, less powerful is something to be analyzed forum by forum. And then we have also individual perspectives. They're also shaped by specific positioning. So the farmer might have firsthand experiences of crop failures, local environment changes, and so on. And finally, or kind of in parallel maybe with identifying these points of view, we want to understand what happens to these ideas as they come about in an online forum in this example, right? So in a discussion about climate, depending on the post that started it, the scientist's focus might be on long-term carbon reduction, and it might clash potentially with, let's say, the farmer's immediate concerns about adapting to local weather, right? And what happens in dialogue, and we've seen this again, this study is not yet completed, but hopefully by the conference in the summer or in person, I will be able to bring you concrete pieces of dialogue to look at together. But we see sometimes these points of view evolving and emerging into a more consensual perspective, let's say, something that we need to balance short-term and long-term goals. But sometimes these perspectives remain in tension. And sadly, a lot of the research Constance and I and other collaborators have done on online spaces shows that there is little real dialogue and real consensus being built online. There is a lot of polarization. And sadly, sometimes people speak to the walls, really, and they just promote their point of view and rarely take into account the point of view of another. So I think that is a meaningful thing to think about, and what this does to horizons of possibility, including possibilities for solutions for climate action, right? So sometimes these conflicts will remain unresolved, and the farmer might feel overlooked, and the scientist might feel unheard from, or unlistened to, let's say. Okay, so this was just a quick example. I hope next time we're going to come with more data. But if you're interested, there's so many other questions that come to mind. For example, in different areas, whether you work on resilience or whether you work with coaches, or, I'm trying to think of the many different papers I've heard today, there are dialogues and conversations about that area. Could a methodology, a method of analysis like HOPE, with this idea of identifying perspectives, positions, and tracing dialogues, how could it be used in these different areas? What kind of changes should we make to it? Because for me, methodology is it's almost like a Lego set. Of course, you have some principles, but it should be adapted to the case. So I'd be very curious moving forward how this can be adapted, improved, and worked on. And also, in particular, many of you I know work with nonverbal and non-textual data, with experiential, type of data. And that would be so interesting to think about what counts as a dialogue of perspective in those, what is the horizon of possibility in those areas. The other point that I think we're all confronted with, and this is way too big to be, I plan to finish in a minute and then close, but is what happens now with AI, with big qualitative data, and how this transforms and challenges our assumptions about research and how research is done. AI and ChatGPT and others are language models, and many of us work with language. So it is such, and I know many of our colleagues are engaged already in this deeper reflection around what is a appropriate use of AI, including in research of this type, right? Because let's face it, AI will not be put back in the box. Actually, we're all living in that box and will continue to. And finally, I was mentioning participatory research. Methods of analysis are not only about collecting data that is a static thing that we just take from the internet or take from people and never tell them back anything, right? We are in dialogue with our participants. We care about the topics we study. We all, I think, aim in one way or another to do participatory type of research, to create change. So these steps of perspective, position, dialogue, they're not only analytical, they could also be used to intervene in the kind of context we want to create, right? Because we as researchers, we are actors in the fields we study. So if it is about climate, for example, yes, I'm looking online at data now, but from what I learn about these dynamics, maybe I can next organize focus groups and use these ideas and the methodology here as a way of prompting more reflexivity, engagement, and finally empowerment. So this is what I wanted to tell you. I hear already a few comments, but I know we're kind of on time with what we said we're gonna do. But if there are any comments or ideas or suggestions, I would be happy to receive them. And I'm hoping that this dialogue could also feed into tomorrow, which is the next day of our event. Yeah, thank you.